Good morning. Just let me put the timer on and we will be away. Welcome to your first class for the MEF Civilisation, first year. Basically what's going to happen is that I'm going to be going through some of the themes and reminding you of history, and because I know you've learned a lot of British history, but you've also forgotten quite a lot of it. And in the second semester, my colleague will be looking more precisely at the exam and how to do it. Although, of course, the message of the first semester is that if you don't know any British history, you won't be able to do the exam. And I'd like to start because I have quite a few people around me who've been very seriously ill with COVID-19. So I'd just like to start by saying thank you to those people who are taking it seriously and wearing the mask and keeping their distance and staying away from large groups and all these annoying things that we have to do. Now, you may well have looked at the program of the exam, and this is the program that's come out this year. Then, first of all, one theme from the Programme de Collège, Voyage et Migration, and four themes from the high school program, Art et Contestation, Diversité et Inclusion, Le passé dans le présent, Utopie, Dystopie. And it's very clearly, we were very clearly informed by the president of the jury that any of these themes might be approached from a literary point of view or from a British studies point of view, history, current affairs, and so on. So I probably will not get through all of these, but I certainly hope to get through at least three of them and give you some ideas of the sort of questions that it would be good to know about to give you the best chance possible of getting through the CAPES in this rather special and difficult year otherwise. Now, one of the most important tools that I'll be using is my teaching blog, and you can see there on your screen the address, or you can just search for John Mullen teaching blog. That will get it you as well. You can see I have the slightly megalomaniac photograph there. And this is where you will have a lot of information to help you along. There will be links to video documentaries, there will be links to newspaper articles, and there will also be practical information here. For example, if I'm ill or on strike or anything like that, this is where you'll find the information. Even if my train is late, so that's where the information will be. And of course, if suddenly the sanitary rules change and we have to work at a distance, then this blog will become very important, and you will be able to consult these videos, or at least this video, through there. Now, it's quite important to revise British history in general, so that when you come across some document which refers to some massive incident, the Industrial Revolution or the Magna Carta or the English Reform or the English Civil War, that you have it in the right century and in the right order and some sort of idea about it. And I recommend to you, and I will give you another link to this, but I did a few years ago a series of lectures in 6 hours, Britain since the Romans in 6 hours, and I do recommend them, and you can find them in MP3 on the blog. Just search for Britain since the Romans, and I will try to remember to put in a link this week, so that this is the week before your first class, where you can also have PowerPoints to go with them, although it may be that the MP3 is enough for you. You will also find scattered around the blog a lot of MP3 classes on the 19th century, on the 18th century, on the 20th century, if you need to revise. And the good thing about MP3, of course, is you can revise while you're doing the shopping or riding around on a bicycle, if you're careful. The book that I would recommend, if you're just going to have one book, well, I'm sure you're going to have several books, but the book that I absolutely recommend is this one, which is published a couple of years ago by and edited by Emmanuel Avril and Pauline Schnapper. Yes, I did write 2 chapters in there. I wrote the chapter on Catholics in Britain in the 21st century, and also the chapter on trade unions, I think. but there are like 50 chapters or 60 chapters, a lot of chapters in there. And this is very much up to date. So although it's very good if you read older books, for example, L'Histoire de l'Angleterre par Roland Marx, a very, very good piece, or Peter Clarke's Britain, what's it called, Hope and Glory, which is about Britain in the 20th century. Nevertheless, this one is bang up to date and in French, which can always help, because it sometimes points out those comparisons which are more necessary for French people. So pleased to be starting. This video will be about half an hour long. I'm going to make videos in chapters of half an hour, and I will explain to you how I intend to use them as we go along. Oh yes, the marking scheme. Now, of course, the most important aspect of these classes is to help you get through the papers of the CAPES, because that's the be-all and end-all. But of course, it also is part of your M1 mark, and I will be informing you about the marking scheme at some point. It's just I just can't remember it right now, but the main emphasis is about. I think we give you. I'm pretty sure I give you a homework, which is a sort of mock paper from the CAPES exam. So let's get started, and I'm going to start with this theme of le passé dans le présent, the past and the present. I'm going to start with this theme because it's my favorite one, because I'm a historian. That's what I do. And so let's have a look what kind of things this theme might imply. I just start with a perhaps slightly humorous picture where you can see this. Now you may notice that in fact it has been photoshopped, and the person on the statue has been taken out, and then the name has been changed. Now, of course, this is an ironic or a humorous photograph, but it's referring to the various campaigns, sometimes successful, in the United States and in Britain. I'm thinking particularly in Bristol, where a statue of a slave trader and founding father or dignitary of the town was thrown into the river. And so it's this reference to that, which are absolutely, of course, the past and the present. These statues come from the past, although very often they were put in a long time after the people involved lived them. So here is a rather humorous reflection on these campaigns. So this helps us to remember that the question of the past and the present can be very controversial, very political, and that's fine. And what is important here is not, from the point of view of the exam, it's not that you give the right opinion. There are no marks for having one opinion or the opposite opinion, but that you show that you understand why people want to get rid of the statue and why other people do not want to. That you have some sort of grasp on there, and your actual opinion on it. What you will guess mine as we go along, but you don't get marks for opinions. You get marks for understanding how the debate is working. This is very recent, June 2020. I'm going to divide this slideshow on the past and the present into 4 sections: the explosion of memory, schools and museums, occupying public space, and debates, apologies, and protests. I found that and PowerPoint automatically proposed these little pictures for me, which is wonderful. So the explosion of memory, what is the explosion of memory? It's nothing to do with bombs and terrorists. It was used, I think it's probably 30 years ago now, to point out the idea that memory, a popular memory, may be becoming more and more important in our societies. And I'm thinking particularly in British society. If you go to a museum today, you expect reflections about the experience of the people at the time. You expect it, if there's a museum on the First World War, you expect it to say, what did your grandfather do? What did your grandmother do? The family memory. And of course, there's a tremendous rise in genealogy. People are much more interested in family history than they were 50 years ago. So all of this has been put down and explained as the explosion of memory, that is the extreme rise in the importance of memory. Secondly, schools and museums as the two most important places that history and the past is made kind of official. It's kind of official. You get official history in schools to some extent, and official history in museums to some extent. So those are obviously important places to look for the past and the present. Thirdly, occupying public space. I'll explain more what that means in a moment. But in fact, the past is everywhere in public space, whether it is on your banknotes, on your banknotes, or the statues, or the name of your street, and so on. And finally, debates, apologies, and protests, because things are changing very quickly. And there's been a whole series of debates, apologies, and protests and changes. Of course, the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States has been the biggest, and indeed the biggest protest movement in the United States for decades. And although one emphasis of this movement has been police violence, there's also been an emphasis on removing symbols of respect for the past of slavery and so on and so on and so forth. So we'll be having a look at some examples of that, but from the British point of view, because obviously I'm not going to talk too much about the United States of America. So I want to start off with the heritage industry and authorized heritage discourse. So what is this? First of all, you'll notice the vocabulary in the English word industry is not exactly the same as the French word industrie. For example, I could say, oh, my brother works in the tourist industry. My sister works in the banking industry. My uncle works in the insurance industry. And these are words which will not be associated with the word industrie. In French, you have other words for that. Le secteur bancaire, le secteur des assurances, and so on. And now the heritage industry, perhaps it's a slightly ironic expression. The idea is that some people are making money from heritage. So heritage, well, how do we define a heritage even? Yeah, it's normally translated as patrimoine, but of course, remember, English is not translated French, so there may well be nuances which are different, but there's a suggestion that people are making money and that it's big. A lot of people work in it. And certainly, if you go around Britain and you go to, if you're lucky enough, yeah, you go to Stonehenge and then to Canterbury Cathedral, and to Edinburgh Castle and Blenheim Palace, and what's that other palace just outside London? I can't remember what it's called. There's a lot to see, and it's all very much marketed and put forward to encourage tourism tourists to come. Tourism is big money in Britain. Now France has more tourists than Britain. I can't understand why, but there you go. But Britain does have a large number of tourists, and the heritage industry is part of it. And the second concept here is the concept of an authorized heritage discourse. That is to say, who has the authority, who has the legitimacy to say what something from the past means. Now, I know that many of you will also be in my seminar on the First World War, where I'll be looking in much more detail about the debates where some people say the First World War means this and other people say it means this. But the authorized version is the version you're most likely to see in the school textbook, on the television, and so on. The authorized heritage discourse, about whatever subject, whether it's about slavery, or whether it's about the Industrial Revolution, or other things. So when we look at the heritage industry, we certainly have a series of big organizations, and one of them here is Historic England. Another one is English Heritage. I think it's English Heritage who runs Stonehenge. Stonehenge makes a lot of money, and they have it's got a very interesting history, Stonehenge. And of course, the prehistory is very interesting. But interesting history is that Stonehenge in the 1930s, apparently it was there was a moment when they were thinking of having it knocked down so as to build a military airport. And then for a long time, well, they decided not to, and for a long time people would visit it, but they would visit it at its big stones. You know? And it's only in these last couple of decades that there has been a heritage centre established with exhibitions to explain the science to people and how we know what we know about Stonehenge. And probably the most interesting thing about Stonehenge is we know where the stones came from, because it's a particular kind of stone, and we know they came from many dozens of kilometers away. And which is interesting, is that they must have had a reason to bring them. And so all of this, of course, is partly speculative, but that's the sort of thing that historic England does. But look at the headline here from their website: "We protect, champion, and save places that define who we are." Okay, so that's very clear heritage statement. In some ways, heritage is an ideology. It's a way of looking at the world. It's a way of interpreting the world. And it's a very fascinating idea. So we protect, yes, so they're in danger. Of course, they may just be in danger of falling down. We champion them. Yes, perhaps there are people against them, and they need a champion. And we save them. We don't let them disappear into ruin or disappear into forgetting. We don't let them forget. But why do we do this? Well, according to this, these are places that define who we are. So this is the whole question of what is national identity. If a British person wakes up in the morning, so I don't really feel I know who I am, do they then go to the Tower of London and Edinburgh Castle and then they feel that they know who they are? Now, I don't want to be excessively cynical, but it is a very interesting thing that they put forward as automatic, the suggestion that these places are not just important because they're old and that they have an interesting story, but because they're part of who we are. And certainly I think that one of the attractions of history, one of the reasons people like history, is that they like to feel that they are part of a long chain and not just a wandering lost soul. So this is an organization which works very hard. Now, it has to be said that most of the places protected, championed, and saved by historic England tend to be places like Blenheim Palace or Townley Hall, or places where rich people used to live. And so we'll be looking at that in a moment, what that means. And here we have an example this is from the newspaper. You see that heritage is the word that's at the top of this, The Guardian. And now I recommend The Guardian because it's free. It's got a political line, probably vaguely similar to Libération. And it's free online, so you can follow the news quite easily like that. So on the heritage page, this time they talk about scale and splendor. I think this is 2 years ago. Scale and splendor. Volunteers work to restore Wentworth Woodhouse, and you can see there is Wentworth Woodhouse, which is not falling down, but probably needs some cleaning. And there are interesting things about this. First of all, obviously, this is a place where rich people used to live, and it's very grandiose, and it represents a particular period. I don't know a lot about this particular one, but notice two things about it. First of all, that they have £130 million to restore it. That is to say that the government or some government feels that it has an importance, but secondly, they're getting volunteers to restore it. So there's quite a large number of people who feel personally involved to such an extent that they're prepared to work for nothing. So this is a very interesting idea, and this links up with this idea of its identity, because if it's part of your identity, then you will feel good. Part of your community's identity, you'll feel good about restoring it and making it available so more people can see it. Yes, and so these are some of the feelings and representations connected with heritage. But heritage is a moving thing. Of course, most of the buildings which are protected by the heritage industry are places which rich people used to live. Although, be careful, things have changed. If you go to Blenheim Palace, just outside Oxford, there's a link with Winston Churchill, but I can't remember for the moment exactly what it is. You'll find something different than if you went there 50 years ago. And that is that there was a couple of rooms which explain to you what life was like for the servants. Whereas 50 years ago, you wouldn't get that because nobody cared about the servants. And this is partly a rise of the democratic spirit in general. People are no longer prepared to accept that we only talk about rich people, although, you know, this is just beginning. I mean, if you look at blockbuster films, it seems 9 out of 10 are about rich people. But in any case, heritage is these days being considered important, not only if it's bourgeois or aristocrats living there now. I think it's probably fair to say that most of the money given by the British government for heritage is to restore palaces and stately homes and so on. But nevertheless, there are other things. And here, on an international level, you see that the UNESCO, this is the United Nations Educational Organization. It's a good point. Exactly what does UNESCO stand for? Well, you will tell me next week. They've made a cultural heritage list, and this is a list of intangible heritage. So these are not buildings, but other things. It's a very, very long list, but they've just added reggae music. And now that's an interesting idea then, isn't it? That they should add reggae music to an international list of things which belong to heritage and therefore deserve protecting and saving, and their history must not be forgotten. So if reggae music is on the international UNESCO list, you can imagine it will be a little easier for people who live in London or people who live in Trinidad to find government money to have a statue to some great reggae singer. There's one who just died very recently. Is it Toot or something like that? Yeah, so it's part of valorizing human experience, which is not just the experience of the elite. So this is completely the past and the present, because when they say reggae music is added to the UNESCO Cultural Heritage List, they're saying we need its history to be known, it must not be forgotten, and it must be publicly valued. It's about publicly valuing aspects of the past, and naturally enough, people who have grown up with reggae music, in particular, for example, black immigrants to Britain, where reggae music was extremely important before it became mainstream in the 1970s. You can imagine them being very pleased that it's being recognized, the value of this music. And here we have another example. This is still on the website of Historic England. Here we have another example of how Historic England has tried to go beyond the traditional heritage industry, which is about aristocrats or maybe bourgeois. And here is a list of 3 new listings announced as Historic England partners with the BBC on Black and British. And so here there are, for example, there is a statue called Platforms Peace and Brixton Station in London, which is thought to be the first work of public sculpture depicting black British people, and it is being listed. I mean, being listed, that means it cannot be removed. There is a bust of Nelson Mandela also being listed. And finally, the public is being asked to add their own memories, pictures, and information about Black history to the record of all listed buildings and places. Yeah, so there's a deliberate attempt by the organisation Historic England to say Black people's history is also important. We know that we've always just talked about white people. Now we want it to be more inclusive. So here we are absolutely with the past in the present. And I have a very interesting video, which I will link to in the blog. I'll probably talk about it later, but just one word about it. They had this short documentary series where they took a Black British family from today and they made them imagine they went back in time. And for a week, they had to live like black immigrants from the West Indies lived in the 1950s, and then for a week like they lived in the 1960s, and then for a week like they lived in the 1970s. You get the idea. And they had a couple of historians to get the details right. And you can imagine that there were both extremely amusing aspects of the sort of things which were popular at the time, which may not be quite so fashionable today, and also very serious aspects where they got older black people to talk about the shock they experienced when they arrived in Britain and they weren't expecting racism. Because at home everybody was black, so they weren't expecting racism. And they arrived and found that people would refuse to serve them in shops and so on. There's some very harrowing stuff. So I'll link that up for you. So let's move on to official history in schools. Now, almost everybody agrees that history should be taught in schools. It's interesting because some people say, oh, Latin should be taught, Latin should not be taught. Some questions are considered to be open for debate. Occitan should be taught or not taught in the South. People debate about it. Nobody seems to object to history being taught, and yet people don't always really know why. Now, of course, I put official between inverted commas because, in theory, there isn't just one official history in Britain. It's a democracy, and so different points of view are available. Although I think it's fair to say you get a sort of range of acceptable opinions and some which are not, you don't hear much about. Certainly history has made a lot of progress since I went to school. I went to high school in the 1970s, and we literally learned that Napoleon did 5 good things and 3 bad things. I remember one of the good things was the Code Civil, apparently. But it was very, very learning list of facts. What do you associate with the Battle of Pinkie, not Perky? So, but nevertheless, there is a sort of, it's official in the sense that the government has agreed that these are the sort of important things that should be done. So how can we test this? Well, I just checked out on Amazon the most popular history school textbooks. These are the school textbooks. Now, I'm pretty sure you don't have a national obligatory school textbook, but this is the one that sells the most. And it was was printed in 2008, but it's still the most popular one today. This is year 7. Now, year 7, that means it's their 7th year at school, and in Britain they often start at 5, so they're 12. They may be 11 or 12. I'm not really up to date with this. And we're only going to look at the front page, but we find out something from the very front page, and you see the title of this then is the Roman Empire and England 1066 to 1500. And immediately in looking at the front page, you notice something which is very 21st century. You know that this was not done in the 1950s or the 1960s. And that is, we have a woman from the Roman Empire on. This is an Egyptian woman, because of course the Roman Empire went very far out. This is a funerary apparently, I'm pretty sure this is a funerary portrait. It's what you put on top of the mummy. It's a picture of the person. They've found a few hundred of these. But what's significant here is we're having a woman on the front page to illustrate the Roman Empire, where certainly traditionally you'd have Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar, and you wouldn't really say much about women at all, because it would be mostly about battles and laws, which the women were not involved in. Underneath here, perhaps a more traditional illustration. This is King John. King John is the king who was obliged by his barons to reduce his power and sign the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta in which year? Pause so that students may answer. 1215, the Magna Carta. Interesting document. Some aspects, some sentences from the Magna Carta were used as recently as the 1960s, when some countries in Africa were writing new constitutions. They used some sentences from the Magna Carta, which had passed through the constitutional documents of Britain, America, and so on. The following year, then year 8, they also have 2 portraits, and again, one of them suggests that a modern 21st century view of history is being taken. The top portrait is Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I. I can't see exactly how many centuries this is. This is supposed to cover. Is it written there? No, it doesn't even say. Does it now? Now, Elizabeth I certainly has a good claim to be on the front page. She was queen for a very long time, and was responsible for stabilizing the Church of England, partly by saying, well, we don't really mind. You can believe a lot of different things and still say in the Church of England. So she was very hard on the Catholics and on the dissidents who were on the outside the Church of England. But inside the Church of England, well, if you wanted to believe this or that about communion, it was not such a big deal. And underneath, I wonder if you can recognize this gentleman. Pause so the students may answer. This is Ludo Equiano. And he was one of the black leaders of the anti-slavery movement in England. Now, of course, the anti-slavery movement in England was mostly led by white people, partly because, firstly, there were not that many black people around, and secondly, because, of course, for middle-class white people, it's much easier to do politics, although they were pretty impressive people. I think at the first meeting there were 12 people. And this was a time when the slave trade was an enormous institution, making billions of dollars and millions of pounds. And the 12 of them got together. Most of them were Quakers. And they'd say, well, we're going to set up a campaign to eliminate, to abolish slavery. You know, all their friends must have thought they were just completely crackers, you know. And so obviously it's very significant that Equiano gets on the front page. It's a recognition that the black contribution, even to the abolition of slavery, has been understated, and it's important to put it in there. To go very, very briefly, the reasons for the abolition of slavery were at least 3 and perhaps 4. Number 1, the revolts of the slaves themselves, whether in the ships or in the plantations, lots of slave revolts, which caused an economic and political problem. Number 2, the movement to abolish slavery was the first mass political movement ever in Britain, and very, very strong in the industrial areas where the working class lived. Very strong working class support for it. And number 3, the economics was changing, and many people believed that the slave system was not as profitable as it should be, as it had been, and therefore that, you know, there may have been economic advantages to getting rid of slavery. And number 4, which is my favorite reason, I mean, not from a moral point of view, but from a historian's point of view, is that there were groups of interests in Britain who hated the slave owners from the West Indies, the white slave owners from the West Indies, who hated the slave owners, not because of slavery, but for other reasons, and that abolishing slavery was a way to get back at them. There is much more on Le Passé dans le Présent, but that's just over half an hour, so I'm going to stop there so we have it in nice chunky chapters.